Hi, my name is Christina Alion, and I am the Foreign and International Law Librarian and Lecturing Fellow at Duke Law. Today I'll be talking to you about legal research in international human rights law. Before we begin, I wanted to give you a quick overview of what you can expect us to cover over the next 10 to 15 minutes. First, I'll talk to you about the scope of the materials we'll be covering today. Then we'll look at some research strategies to help you organize yourself before you begin your legal research. Then we'll look at resources and legal instruments, and we'll conclude by looking at different resources that can help you stay on top of developments in this area of law. So first, the scope of the materials we'll be covering today. Generally, they will be introductory sources, so materials that will help you begin your legal research. They will generally be English language resources, although some of them may have options for other languages. They will also be freely available online. And even though international human rights law has both regional and domestic components, we'll really be focusing on those resources that are limited to international law more generally. With respect to research strategies, there are generally two paths that you can go down when you begin your legal research in this area. First is if you have a specific treaty in mind, and second is if you don't have a treaty in mind. So let's first look at what to do if you have a specific treaty in mind. There are several questions you'll want to ask yourself. First, which country or countries are party to that particular treaty? Are there any relevant reservations, understandings, or declarations that you should be aware of? Which body monitors treaty compliance? And then what sorts of documents does that body produce that might be relevant for your research? If you don't have a specific treaty in mind, the questions you'll be asking yourself will be a little bit more general. So first, you'll want to consider what subject are you interested in. For example, torture, genocide, civil and political rights, or economic and social rights. Then you'll want to consider which group of people or demographic might be most affected by that particular treaty. Typical groups include women, children, indigenous peoples. Then you'll want to think about a relevant date or time period that particular treaty may have been at issue or entered into force, and then the country or regions that might be particularly interested in the outcome of that treaty. Now, before we actually start looking at resources, I wanted to make sure that a distinction was clear between primary and secondary sources. So primary sources are really the law itself, so the law as enacted by relevant branches of government, codes or regulations, for example, would qualify. Alternatively, secondary sources help by providing legal analysis or commentary, and in legal research we often use these to locate or explain the law. And if that distinction is still a little bit unclear to you, I've provided a link below to a website maintained by the Law Library of Congress, which provides both additional commentary and examples of secondary sources. Now on this chart, you'll see that I've included primary sources on the left and analogous secondary sources on the right. So first, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and then to the right, I've included a link to a book which provides commentary on that convention. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. To the right, I've included an article authored by Professor Helfer that explores some of the implications of copyrights with respect to that treaty. And then finally, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. I've included a link to relevant preparatory documents which provide information about the treaty drafting history. I'll talk a little bit more about those materials in a few slides. So the different resources we'll be covering today, they overlap necessarily, but they do have different sorts of aspects that may be particularly useful depending on where you are in your research. So legal research guides are one of the first places that I recommend for novice researchers that are unfamiliar with a particular area of law. If you go to your favorite search engine and simply include in quotation marks human rights and research guide or legal research guide, you'll find a number of freely available research guides online. You'll see that I've included some representative examples here. Some are authored or maintained by law librarians at academic institutions, and others are maintained by organizations. So for example, the United Nations has an excellent research guide, and the American Society of International Law also provides an excellent research guide. And here's just a screenshot of the United Nations Research Guide. You'll see across the top that there are tabs which will help orient yourself to the relevant sections. And to the right, you'll see there's actually contact information. So if you have specific questions, you can actually contact one of the reference librarians who will be happy to help you. And the thing to keep in mind about research guides generally is they are often organized in a very similar fashion. There are usually tabs across the top and a menu to the left or right to help you navigate and find relevant materials. Articles, of course, are very useful when you're researching. I've included several different sources for freely available articles online, some of which you may already be familiar with. Bepress, SSRN, the Max Planck Institute, and then of course Google Scholar. So Bepress essentially allows you to search as well as drill down by subject. SSRN allows authors to provide copies of their articles that have already been published, as well as drafts of articles that they're hoping to publish or working on. The Max Planck Institute is essentially an index that includes links to the full text documents when they're available. And then Google Scholar, which many of you have already probably used, allows you to search for articles freely available online. But one thing to keep in mind when you're using Google Scholar is that your results may change depending on where you're physically located. So for example, if you are searching Google Scholar when you're physically in a library, there's a good chance that you may actually have access to the subscription-based resources that that library has paid for, and they may show up in your results. So don't let that throw you off. It's actually one of the features that makes Google Scholar so useful. And here's simply a screenshot of Bepress. You can see that they've included popular articles to the left and popular institutions, featured publications, and popular articles to the right. There are a number of human rights databases. I unfortunately can't cover them all, but the International Justice Resource Center does an excellent job of providing one place with many of these databases, and I have pulled a few out that I think are particularly useful. The Universal Human Rights Index, which is searchable by country, right, or UN body. The University of Minnesota's Human Rights Library, which allows you to search and browse both primary and secondary sources. And then I also included a link to HUDOC, which allows you to search cases from the European Court of Human Rights. Now, technically, this is a regional organization, but because this database is so powerful and does such a good job of allowing you to search across these cases and materials, I couldn't not include it. Now, here's just a screenshot of the International Justice Resource Center, and I did highlight for you the Research tab, which does include a link to those databases I was mentioning on the earlier slide. And take a note of the additional options that are provided under this tab. So for example, the books and articles section is useful as well. Now, non-governmental and intergovernmental websites are another resource that you can use. HurrySearch, which allows you to search across over 5,000 different human rights websites, is a great place to begin if you're not quite sure what you're looking for. Alternatively, if you know that you're looking for an NGO, the Duke NGO database allows you to search across nearly 700 different NGO websites and has filtering and search options. The Northwestern list of IGOs is comprehensive, and they've actually included separate tabs for the UN and EU, which is especially useful given the volume of materials that both of those bodies produce. And here's just a quick screenshot of the NGO Research Guide. You'll see that by taking advantage of the human rights and international filters, I was able to limit the nearly 700 NGO databases down to just over 100. And And then last but not least, of course, libraries are an incredible resource. They often include both print and electronic resources. If they have a library catalog that you can search, some quick tips include searching by keyword, which is a very general search. It allows you to search across the title, the summary, or table of contents if those are included. And that's great if you aren't quite sure where to begin, so you just have a sort of a general idea of what you're looking for. But if you have something more specific in mind, the advanced search feature tends to be more powerful. And then, of course, once you have your list of results, take advantage of any filters that are available after the fact. And then human rights legal instruments, there are a number of different places online where you can find relevant materials. Human rights specific website from the UN OHCHR, of course, has many of these resources in one place for you. And then the UN Audiovisual Library and the Electronic Information System for International Law both focus on international law more generally, but do have a human rights section. So in this case, I have a screenshot for you of the Audiovisual Library of International Law. You'll see on the left that I selected the Human Rights tab, and then went and selected the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The tabs just below the title show you what types of materials you can expect to see in this resource, and I selected the Documents tab specifically because it includes selected preparatory documents. If you remember from the earlier slide, these include treaty drafting history materials. They're often referred to as travaux préparatoires as well, and they are a notoriously difficult area for legal researchers. So having a resource that puts them together in one place for you is incredibly valuable. There are a few other places online that you can use when you're looking for these materials. The Yale Law Library has done a great job of collecting both citations to print resources as well as providing links to travaux préparatoires online. And then Jonathan Prater at the University of Texas has authored an article online which provides even more guidance for those of you who are looking for particularly hard to track down materials. If you're interested in looking at the treaty status, there are a number of resources again. I've highlighted two for you here. The UN Treaty Collection and the UN OHCHR website both have information about the treaty status of human rights treaties. Here I've highlighted for you the UN Treaty Collection website. Even though it can be a little bit cumbersome to search, once you've found the relevant treaty, it tends to have really useful and up-to-date information. You'll see here that for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, they've included the entry into force, registration, status, citation, and then below you'll actually find the different countries that are a party to that treaty, as well as any reservations, understandings, or declarations. Now, if you want to stay on top of developments in this area of law, of course, there are a number of news resources, blogs, and newsletters. And I wanted to highlight my personal favorite, which is the Global Legal Monitor, which is maintained by the Law Library of Congress. And they have an RSS feed that you can cater to your specific research interests. You can select different countries or areas of law, and human rights is one of the subject headings that you can select. And their different legal research experts pull their information from both international and domestic newspapers. Now, as you're researching, you will necessarily encounter other areas of law that you might need to look into a little further. Typical areas include treaties, the United Nations more generally, and then, of course, regional organizations. And before I end, I wanted to acknowledge that this area of law can be particularly challenging to research. The volume of materials tends to be quite great. Language can be an issue, so depending on the languages you're most comfortable with, not all materials are translated. And then access can be an issue as well. Even though more recent materials do tend to be available online, first of all, not everybody has access to the internet, and there are still a number of materials that really are only available in print. Nevertheless, this is a dynamic, evolving, and interesting area of law, and as many of you know, it really has the potential to affect meaningful change for people around the world. And then I had to mention one final resource, the International and Foreign Legal Research coursebook by Mary Rumsey and Marcy Hoffman. I referred to their chapter on human rights extensively as I put together this presentation. It's an outstanding resource for international and foreign legal research of all kinds. If you have a library, I hope you will check to see if they have a copy. So thank you so much, and I hope you will enjoy legal research in international human rights law as much as I do.